If you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. It's back over to the right. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good evening, everyone. This is the regularly scheduled meeting of the BET for May 2008. We have a little bit of a jumbled agenda as a result of other people's schedule. I will call on Madam Clerk for the first routine item pertaining to the Law Department. Madam Clerk.
Yes, good evening. SC 27 for Selectmen, additional appropriation for $125,000. I so move.
Second.
Second by Mr. Mason. Discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? It's 11-0-0. Mr. Kelly did inform me that he is traveling and will not be in attendance this evening. I now turn it over to Mr. Mason, Chairman of the Budget Committee, regarding the first non-routine item. Mr. Mason.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Don't we have SC 26 first, or are we postponing that a little bit later?
That's the first non-routine item.
Gotcha. Okay. SE 26 is an additional appropriation for the Law Department for $300,000. The Law Committee has taken this up as well. Our vote was 4-0. This is to bring the last three big cases that we have for the town pretty much to a closure, and our vote was 4-0. And I'm sorry, I moved the item.
Moved by Mr. Mason. Second by Mr. Simon. Discussion. Just so that it's noted, Ms. Barton.
Just to note, the Law Committee took this up at our recent meeting and approved the request for an additional appropriation by a vote of 2-0.
Other discussion? I just think it should be noted that in the 08-09 budget, we have asked the Law Department to, in fact, request, and it's been appropriated by the RTM and approved. To budget for the entire amount. So we would not expect to have interim appropriations next year, unlike our request this year, which was to come back when, in fact, you needed the money. So we're optimistic that Mr. Fox will not be in attendance at our meetings next year regarding interim appropriations for outside counsel fees. But thank you for coming here. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0. Madam Clerk, the routine items now.
Yes, routine items for the Budget Committee. HD 7, Health Department, approval to use $81,634.
Second.
RT1, RTM, additional appropriation for $4,000. FD1, Fire Department, transfer for $178,918. PW6, DPW, transfer for $205,000. PW7, DPW, additional appropriation for $90,000. PW8, DPW, transfer for $115,000. I so move.
115?
Isn't it 115?
Right, okay. Any discussion on those items? Mr. Mason.
Mr. Chairman, I believe we have a revised blue sheet for RT1 coming. Do we have that?
Yes, it's
Okay.
in the package.
And this will be the same dollar amount, but it'll be for $4,000 just for out of your 300 major object code, correct?
3,500.
It's 3,500, I'm sorry.
In Walter Supplies, 53010.
Okay.
It's on the corrected blue sheet, correct? So the agenda is wrong, and the minutes will reflect what's on the blue sheet, on the revised blue sheet, and not the agenda, correct?
Correct. Correct.
Revised blue sheet is in the...
That's what we'll,
It was in the packet that was sent out after the Budget Committee meeting.
Yeah, but that's not what was separate. But the revised sheet and what was just said are not the same.
Correct. Say that again, then.
So are we budgeting $500? Are we budgeting $500 for overtime, or I thought we were budgeting $4,000 for office supplies. That was my understanding.
I thought we were just changing the rental to office supplies.
They don't,
If the event is not held at a town facility, then there would be no need for the overtime. Right?
so do you want to take this and make this non-routine, vote on the routine and come back to this, or change this?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Mason?
My recommendation would be just to change the RT1 blue sheet and remove the A101 51100 line and just make the office supplies line 4,000, and that would be representative of what we did in the Budget Committee.
Any objection to that amendment? Okay, so we're working off the revised blue sheet, just to make sure everyone is okay, and that would be coming from Department 101, Object Code 53010, $4,000. Any other discussion on the routine matters? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0.
Did Mike second that?
Mike, second all of them.
Okay.
Mr. Mason for the non-routine applications.
First item on the non-routine is NW2, Nathaniel Witherell. It's an additional appropriation for $329,600. I so move the item.
Second.
That matter's been moved and seconded by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, this was an item that came before us for Nathaniel Witherell. We had a discussion on the item, found it to be in routine order, and it's actually an item that we'd like to convert over to a transfer rather than additional appropriation for the same amount. And I would so move that.
Well, we need to identify the codes.
My understanding is that there is a blue sheet. Mr. Augustine?
The appropriation as originally submitted was requesting $329,600 to be added primarily to the 51,000 accounts, wages and other salaries. And in our accounting, we're still asking for the same line items to go into the 51,000s. But what we're looking to do is pull out of insurance, which is Object Code 56280, $246,000. And out of the account 52260, which is fuel for heating, $83,600. The $246,000 coming out of the insurance, which is the large item, we used to buy insurance for a full year, which is what was included in our budget, which was $300 and some odd thousand plus. At the request of the risk manager of the town of Greenwich, in order to be able to get the insurance policies of the town of Greenwich to be consistent with those of, or us with the town of Greenwich, we only bought a 4-month policy, which ran us about $95,000, which leaves us with this excess money in that account. In next year's budget, it is covered because we have the full $320,000 budget. It's a timing question of cash flow and not of expense, so that's some available dollars right now. The other item, which is $83,600, that is coming out of fuel for heating, and that is because when we did this year's budget, we're not sure exactly where we were going to be in fuel cost, and since that time, the town has negotiated a very, very favorable plan for purchase of gas, and that's why we have the excess fuels there, the excess dollars.
Discussion on this item. Nathaniel Witherell was sort of a ping pong in direction from, I guess, the BET and Finance Department. So apologize for that. I guess originally it had come forward with a transfer and then an additional appropriation, but there was money there available. So we appreciate you getting this to us this evening. Any questions on this? Ms. Tarkington?
Yeah, I just, Ray, like to understand. So you had budgeted $246,000 in insurance this year that isn't needed because it's also, you then, when you were budgeting next year, budgeted that inclusive in some other amount?
No, what I do is my insurance runs me about $300,000, and that's for medical malpractice insurance for the course of 12 months. And it normally runs from March 1st through the end of February. And what happened is getting this in sync with this year's town policies. We did 4 months, which cost us about $95,000, which left the remainder available to use. Actually, the number was more than 300, it was like 325 or something like that. So there's no effect other than cash flow this year, which is favorable to the town. And then next year, it's just a question of timing. It'll be moved up from my March numbers to a July number.
So next year you have the full $325,000
And that will theoretically
It's
be the
already been
expense.
budgeted in the budget that was
It's
approved.
already budgeted, and the budget is approved, and we will not be requesting any more.
Thank you.
Other questions? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0. Thank you. Just before we move on, so this was submitted because it was originally an additional appropriation and went to the RTM, to the clerk, because the RTM deadline was on Friday. Who's going to be responsible for informing the clerk that this should be pulled from the agenda? Is that Finance or Nathaniel Witherell? I just want to make sure while everyone's here.
The departments put the item on the agenda.
Okay, so you'll call, so Nathaniel Witherell will call the clerk to remove it from their agenda? Okay, thank you. Mr. Mason?
Next item is ED 9, Board of Education, additional appropriation, Clark House roof, $700,000, and I so move the item.
It's been moved by Mr. Mason. Second by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
Mr. Chairman, ED 9, the roof, this is a roof replacement on the Clark House building. The roof was originally scheduled to be replaced in the 10-11 budget, along with several others at the high school. The appropriation will come from the current budget out of the Capital Non-Recurring Fund. If approved, the Board of Ed will immediately commit the project and complete it over the summer. The roof has a leak that seems to be past economic repair point. Our discussion involved the BOE will be deferring some piping projects that are currently scheduled for the summer. This should reduce our borrowing for the next budget. Our vote was 4-0 in favor.
Discussion. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0. Mr. Mason?
ED 10 is an additional appropriation for $500,000 for operating expenses for the Board of Ed. This is a $500,000 interim to cover potential shortfalls at the end of this fiscal current year. Before the modular events, the Board of Ed had anticipated of having a surplus of $350,000 to $390,000 that would revert back to the general fund from their operating budget. With all the associated costs of relocating the students, hiring consultants, they feel that they need this appropriation just in case. The Hamilton Avenue relocation costs were kept separate and reported to be about $475,000 to the committee. If all goes well, most of this appropriation will not be needed, but it seems wise to have this item approved and ready for the RTM in June for their in prolong. So we do not have to have a special meeting, which would, remember, we keep the town books open for 60 days, so we want to make sure that they can close out their fiscal year. And our vote was 4-0. And I so move.
Moved by Mr. Mason. Second by Mr. Simon. Discussion. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstention? 11-0-0. I would note that for the audience, there are members of the audience who necessarily did not attend our budget committee meetings. A lot of the reason for the lack of discussion here tonight on these items, and quite frankly on some of the other applications, is that a lot of work goes into these applications at the budget committee level. For the most part, all BET members attend those meetings, and while the budget committee is only 4 members of the BET, questions get raised by any member of the BET who wishes to ask a question and gets recognized by the chair. So with that, we'll move on to the next item, ED11. Mr. Mason?
ED11, Board of Education. This is a release of a condition by the Board of Estimate and Taxation to the Hamilton Avenue School Building Committee for $133,644. I so move it.
It's been moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
The release of these funds, Mr. Mazza came before the chairman of the building committee came before our committee, and he gave us the breakdowns of the cost. He also gave us a pretty good update on the school project in itself, on where it's going and how it's doing. Our vote was 4-0-0 on this, and this number was part of the release that the BET had put on it at the last interim basis appropriation. And you'll see when we get to the next item, they're looking for an insurance just to carry over because of the budget cycle with the RTM and the BET this month. But again, our vote was 4-0 in favor of this one.
Can you so move?
And I so move.
It's been moved and second. Discussion on this. Let me also just add that as the BET already starts to look forward to the 9-10 budget, it appears ever increasing that it's going to be a difficult year. In fact, we've already begun to have discussions with the first selectman regarding next year, or not only the 8-9 budget, but the 9-10 budget. And while not only with this appropriation, but the prior 2 appropriations, especially ED10, anything that the Board of Ed can do to help keep costs down, knowing that we're going to have challenges facing us in the coming years, would be appreciated, as their budget is roughly half of operating budgets. So I just think that it's noteworthy to reference that now, so that we all can go forward in the same manner. Further discussion on ED11. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0. Mr. Mason?
Next item on our agenda is ED12, Board of Education, additional appropriation, Hamilton Avenue School Building Committee, $200,000, and I so move the item.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
Members of the BET, Mr. Mazza stayed for this one. This is an additional appropriation for the Hamilton Avenue project of $200,000. It's similar to the BOE operating request. It's a just in case. Our committee has had discussions about the needs and also a subject to release. We will have 2 regular meetings to release funds if they are needed after the RTM approval. The RTM cycle is before the BET cycle. As a footnote, the project has had tremendous amount of publicity from the dollars point of view. However, the budget is only over, and I'm not sure this number was correct, but I picked it up as $800,000 on a $30,005,000 project. So Mr. Mazza is asking for this, and I believe we're going to be recommending to a subject to release for just in case on the close up. He's in the final items on this project. I think he reported the building at 95 or 96% complete. So this would be there just in the fact that once the RTM meets in June, they don't meet in July and August. Therefore, we'll be able to have this in reserve, approved, ready to go.
Mr. Mazza, would you mind discussing the project briefly?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
I know when we came to you last week, we sort of said we have a moving target here, and we do, in a sense that we asked the contractor about 6 weeks ago to come in with all the change orders they thought they had left on the project, and to see where we stood. And obviously, they didn't submit a lot right away. In the last week, they started submitting a lot of change orders. Some of them are change orders that we had already addressed once before and rejected. So they're coming back with some of them. But they're up now with those proposed change orders at about $230,000. We do not anticipate approving a lot of those. We had allocated approximately $95,000 for change orders. So, it's obviously the money that we now have, we're going to use up. We're going to use all of it up. And I think we'll probably have to use some of this money, the $200,000. It looks like we'll have to use some. How much, I don't know. Again, we'll know a lot better in June. The project is moving along quite well now. We're about 85% painted in the building. Most of the second floor, all the ceilings are in now, and all the floors except for a couple of rooms on the first floor. The floors are down all on the second floor. We'll be moving on to the first floor, putting the flooring down in there in the next week or two. We plan on, in the first week in June, starting to move the furniture into the building. So, we're getting there. We're not that far away now. Everything seems to be falling in place. I'm sure there'll be a few glitches at the end. There always are in a building construction job. We're trying to be proactive with both the building department and the fire marshal's office by bringing them in ahead of time and reviewing things to see if we have problems and pick them up. And so that's the stage we're at right now.
Mr. Mazza, can you just briefly talk about, as people drive by, there's those steel panels that are not on the building, so it all makes it look like the building isn't coming along. Can you address that point?
I know. Unfortunately, those are the last panels. The ones you see are the last panels they're going to be getting. We had a problem with the delivery of the metal panels on the exterior of the building. They were much slower than we anticipated originally. Then they said they weren't going to get a lot of them until July, but they've improved that, and most of the panels are now on the job, on the project. They're being installed. The ones that you see right at the end of the building are the last panels to go on, and they're due in within the next 2 weeks. And I know, and unfortunately, what you see is very visible, but it's actually a minor part of the job.
And they will not impact whether or not the building is able to get a temporary CO? No,
they don't impact that. The building is watertight, and we haven't had any water in the building in a very long time now.
Before we get, I know you have a condition, other questions for Mr. Mazza as hopefully this project starts wrapping up? Mr. Mason.
One comment to Mr. Mazza. The 133 that we're releasing, that's what you think you're going to use most of, and you may have to dip into the 200, correct?
Yeah, we're definitely going to end up using all of that 133.
Okay, and I think one of the other things that I didn't report is that you're getting inspections now weekly, you're having the good communication, so it's...
We're getting inspections, I won't say daily, we're getting them twice a week. The building department has been very good and very helpful for us, and they come in, they get overwhelmed sometimes because Worth asks them for like 10 inspections in a day, and they have a problem doing that, but they have been very good to us, and they've been helpful.
Thank you. And, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to read the condition for the item from the Budget Committee. The $200,000 interim request is subject to the release in whole or in part by the Board of Estimate and Taxation upon receipt of satisfactory documentation evidencing the need.
Mr. Kremick?
I think this is a prudent contingency, given the importance of this project and given the importance of finishing it this summer without any delay. The reason for the contingency in whole or in part is the Budget Committee thought that we could review the progress in both our June and July meeting and release a portion of the contingency, as there was need. And so there'd be some control on this, but I support this contingency.
Other discussion? So practically, how would this work? They would come forward at the June BET meeting, presumably? Budget Committee?
I would assume we would come into the June BET. We'll have to, again, we'll be giving a report. We have to go to the RTM at the beginning of June, too, so essentially...
Right, actually, I think it's the day before.
It's the day before.
And then the next night would be Budget Committee.
To both at that point,
And then the money would be fully released the following week. Okay. You'll probably have more information, too, for the RTM as to whether or not you'll need this money in either support.
That's what I'm saying. By the end of May, we'll have a lot more information.
And the next building committee meeting is the 27th?
27th, a week from tomorrow.
And that'll be at the site. Okay, thank you. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay. Mr. Mason.
Next item, Mr. Chairman, is PW9, Department of Public Works, an interim appropriation for $300,000 for waste removal services, and I so move the item.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
Mr. Chairman, this is one of the items that's fairly clearly laid out on our blue sheets. This is for dumping fees. Back in April of 2007, the town was hit with those back-to-back storms where we had some extremely large tonnage that we're getting rid of. This is $300,000 to come out of our regular general fund balance. It was presented by Deputy Commissioner of Public Works Amy Sievert, and our committee basically went through the item, and we were in favor of it 4-0.
Discussion. Just have one question. So do we think we're going to hit the 09 numbers based on what we know today?
For the new contracts?
Right.
Still keeps moving. In terms of the new contracts for waste disposal,
It's in process, and
we're
I
still.
would just say that we're trying to work within the budget. That's been appropriate.
Any other discussion on this point? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? 11-0-0. And finally, PW 10.
Mr. Chairman, PW10 is an interim appropriation out of our general fund to the Commission on Aging for the, it's labeled as BOE Central Office / Senior Center, and I so move the item.
Moved by Mr. Mason. Second by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
Mr. Chairman, this additional appropriation led to some extremely lengthy discussion by our committee, and at the end, our vote was 3-1. One of the votes out of the 3 in favor was to make sure that we got this here tonight. This is a pretty interesting policy decision moving forward. Last month, the BET received an outline or a report from the Commission on Aging to lay out the potential future requirements of the seniors in town. And what we're looking at is an interim appropriation for $30,000 to see if that plan would fit operationally within the Havamar building. Some members feel this would bring a conclusion to the question of what we're going to do with some of the buildings in our future capital plan. Some questioned if the report that we accepted last month, we received it or we accepted it. I would think that the answer to that was that we received it, which led to many other questions. Everything from future staffing of the senior program to operating cost. The negative vote on the issue was, on the biggest issue is that we have in our current capital plan moving forward, we do have funds for a Board of Education administration headquarters. And they're in the process right now with an appropriation from last budget of doing their needs assessment. And obviously, the question came up, the BOE would have to be out of that building first and have a new home construction. So between the timing of our CIP process and getting the Board of Ed in their new building, there was some question, as I said, lengthy discussion. There's also a fairly strong sentiment with a private entity who's looking to occupy the Havamar building for their usage. There's also a strong sentiment from one of the members to look into a joint venture there. So again, our vote was 3 in favor, 1 against, and I so move the item.
Discussion. Mr. Stone?
Mr. Chairman, can I suggest that the first selectman be recognized to weigh in on this particular proposal?
Sure. I also, my understanding is that Mr. Manelli is here to speak on it, and Mr. Deibler, if in fact there
That is correct, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, members of the BET. Following up on the conversation that occurred at the Budget Committee meeting last month, you did in fact receive the report from the Commission on Aging as to the market assessment for their population today and going into the future. What that study did not necessarily provide in detail is the precise location or future location for such a program. It did look at the current site, the current site with off-site programming, and the Havemeyer building. It looked at the Havemeyer building because, in fact, when this issue was before the BET last year during the budget process, we gave direction to both the Board of Ed and to these seniors to look at their future locations. And what Mr. Deibler has done working with members of the commission and Mr. Minnelli is to try to pare down what essential space they do need to carry out their program. It has been Mr. Minnelli's opinion that we do not have the information necessary to rule out the use of Havemeyer, and therefore we're coming to you tonight to provide those resources so that the Commission on Aging, working with me and the Superintendent of Building Maintenance and Construction, can undertake that initiative. I do know that there are those who want to see collaboration between the proposed entity, the Greenwich Center for the Arts, and the seniors, and I think that is certainly not off the table, but before the seniors can go forward and look at what is their core program and where would they best be able to provide it, they would like the opportunity to assess this building and keep in concert with what they felt was going to be the undertaking last May when the funds were finally approved. You have Mr. Deibler here, who you've heard from previously, but Mr. Minnelli can best speak to the rationale for expending the additional funds to look at the building. And I just point out the one handout you had previously received, that's the one that says interim funding requests. The second one that says senior center space issues was one, in fact, put together by the Commission on Aging, and I distributed for your information this evening.
Good evening. Alan Minnelli, Superintendent, Building Construction and Maintenance, Department of Public Works. The reason why we put the interim funding request in is that it's very obvious that the senior center currently is split between the senior center function and the Arts Council, who leases the upper floors. The building right now is 27,000 square feet, and it has 14,000 square feet of usable space. So when you go through the analysis that was performed for the Commission on Aging, they exceed that 14,000 square foot programming space in the existing senior center, and that's even if we move out the Arts Council. Their lease is coming up for renewal in 2 years. By the way, all this is just pre-planning because we'd have to wait for leases. The Board of Education has to move out, so it's really to establish that other entity, the Performing Arts Center, to finally find out if the Havemeyer building is excess inventory to the town, which would then move it forward to lease it. Right now, we cannot answer that question. So what the funding appropriation does is it takes the 46,000 square feet of the Havemeyer building, and it applies the study that was performed by Perkins and Eastman for the Commission on Aging to see if it fits. Do a co-review of the building and look to, we know obviously that they're coming in at 30,000 square feet of programming space. Obviously, the Commission on Aging, if they're going to expand their program, would have to probably come back and do some kind of a business plan for you guys. But we need to establish now what is in that building and what we could use the spaces for. We might come out with net square footage that's unused, that's available for other town functions, maybe move some of the functions out of this building, which would be appropriate because it's right across the green. There is a beautiful auditorium inside of that building that's right now is been covered up with drop ceilings because the Board of Education needs that square footage. Maybe that auditorium could be used, opened up for the public for RTM meetings or BET meetings. Just to have an auditorium on Greenwich Avenue would be very appropriate and very useful to the town. But we don't know this, and we need to get these funds to establish the programming of that building.
Mr. Mason.
Where were you Tuesday night? No, that's... with this study you're doing, you're representing the town and a building usage. What else would you be able to use this information for? Hypothetical, the Board of Ed decides they want the building, they want to stay there, they want to renovate it. Any of this information pertinent to
Sure.
that?
Because they'll be doing a code review, and because if the Board of Education stays in that building, would have to use that same information because the building has to be accessible.
Give me a list of other potential uses of this, where this 30,000, what we receive from that, what you might be able to apply that to.
Besides the senior center and establishing the fact that the building is a need in the town and possible use by the Board of Education, I can't think of another need the study would do.
Alan, I just want to go over some of the numbers.
Sure.
If we can. So Havemeyer currently has 46,000 usable square feet of,
No, Havemeyer total is 46,559.
okay. And how much is usable, or is you don't know that?
I don't know that yet.
Okay. And presumably that's what the study would tell us?
Yes.
Old
Not
Town-
only just square footage, but also configurations of rooms, because that's important.
Old Town Hall has 27
668
total, and usable of only 14?
856. And right now, 2 of those floors, 6,500 is leased.
So currently, the Commission on Aging has about 8,000 square feet.
Yep. Yes.
So in their plan document, they have over 20 now.
Yes.
So the commission, so going to the Commission on Aging as opposed to the work that you would do, your plan document has been approved by the Commission on Aging?
Among the documents is a proposed space allocation, and that is still under review. One of the things that we did with Mr. Minnelli was go through that and review some of those space proposals. One of them, famously quoted in the newspaper, was a fixed-seat tiered movie theater, which we are not looking to do. And so with some initial kind of a draft review of that, we were looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 23,000 square feet, and the purposes are congruent with the findings from the community-wide study. And that's a key issue for the commission. The commission did accept the study for the purposes of defining the program of the Senior Center of the Future. And that's what the study gave us. It gave us the parameters for programs that seniors in the community from the ages of 55 on up say that they want over the next 20 years. And that's the basis on which we then look at the spaces and decide whether or not those spaces can accommodate those purposes.
Were any financial considerations taken into account in coming up with the programs or the amount of space that was needed?
At this point, there were no financial estimates given for either the renovation of the existing building or for, say, building a new building according to the specifications. We don't have any of that.
So what do you think is the process by which the town would undertake to have that plan go from simply the Commission on Aging out to the public to us eventually through financing of this? Because this will take, I'm assuming this will increase your operating expenses.
Yes.
If you built out this program. And if you built out this program, it's triple the amount of space you're currently using. Do you have a plan for rolling that out for an approval process?
No, at this point, we have a rough estimate of what our steps are going to be. Obviously, the first step would have to be to come up with a baseline program that met the needs that would cross the threshold of a viable senior center for the future. We know that the current programming will not succeed in the future, and that if we try to continue it in the current direction, the program simply will not survive. But we do know that in the future, the senior population is going to have other requests and demands. We need to have a baseline of what that program will look like, and that's what we're in the process of working on now. And in looking at the Havemeyer building, we were going to be working with the architect to give us some of that information in relation to the specific building space.
Mr. Kremick?
I think that we're very much at a crossroads right now, both with respect to planning for the seniors in the future and with respect to possible other uses for the Havemeyer building. I happen to be a strong proponent of the collaborative idea, the idea of the Senior Center and the Commission on Aging coming forward with ideas for using Havemeyer in collaboration with the Greenwich Arts Council, or Greenwich, what's it called? The Greenwich
Center for the Arts.
Center for the Arts. And the Arts Council is also going to be involved in that, as I understand. We do have an opportunity where we have two buildings right across the street from each other, both landmark buildings, both of which can be useful for public use. And I urge the Senior Center, the Center for the Arts Council to get together and to collaborate in coming up with a model for public use of these two very important buildings, and not to be inflexible and just look at these facilities in a very limited way, because it's very clear that a collaborative model would work. For example, the Commission on Aging has done a study for what a future senior center would need. Things like cafe, things like social areas, things like dance studios. Those are all things that could easily be adapted from the plans that the Arts Council has. This is all assuming, of course, that the Board of Education doesn't want to stay in Havemeyer. If they do, we have another issue. But assuming that the Board of Education is willing to free up Havemeyer for other uses, I see this as collaborative. I'm willing to support this because I do think you need professional guidance, but I hope that you're going to use that money to try, at least in part, to develop a collaborative model for public use of this very important public space.
We agree. In fact, we did a SWOT analysis, and the second of our three alternatives looked at the current site with off-site programming, assuming the Arts Center. And we looked at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats with an Arts Center across the street as part of the programming that we would take advantage of. What we don't know, and what we won't be able to know, is whether the space in the Havemeyer building is even worth us considering this, because if you look at a floor plan, the Havemeyer building is basically a bunch of cubes. They were classrooms that were created 100 years ago, and we don't know if those cubes can be adapted to non-cubic purposes. And some of the things that a senior center would want would involve more flexible spaces than those cubes might provide. So we need to know whether or not it's worth it to even enter into those kinds of negotiations, or whether we would have to come back and tell you that it's not worth any kind of renovation money for the Havemeyer for a senior center if the spaces can't be adapted for senior center purposes. Since we don't know the answers to that, we need to have that analysis.
Mr. Manelli, I take it you...
Yeah, Ed, I just want to comment here. We own the town owns the building, and we have a unique opportunity with the Center of Performing Arts to renovate the building at no cost to the town. And we don't want, we'd be very poor judgment if we don't give them a reason what we want to do with that building. And we need to do this study. Now, we own the building, so we control the town, well, Board of Ed, we're assuming the Board of Ed's out. So we would want to make sure that, like what Sam's saying, that the configuration of the building internally will fit the programs. Whether the program is the 23,000 square foot program or the 30,000 square foot program that was designed by Perkins Eastman, we know that right now the senior center is about 7,000 square feet, and it's not enough. I mean, I think you've all walked through that building. They're just jammed to the gills and they're in need of a little bit more space. So we know we could fit in the building, but exactly how we would fit in the building has to be determined by a professional. And that's what this $30,000 is going to do.
Ms. Tarkington.
Yeah, Mr. Manelli, I'd like to understand a little bit more on how you might proceed on this study. Will you be continuing with Perkins Eastman? And when you do your study, will it be, say, similar to to how the town looked at the approximately 124,000 square feet in the Nathaniel Witherall buildings? Will there be an engineering study done, structural engineering study? I mean, you talked about code, but engineering and structural engineering, obviously, to get a better feel for what Mr. Deibler is talking about. Will there be a cost analysis of what needs to be renewed to extend the life of that for the town or any user for 15 years or for some period of time? I think, on the Witherall, the core study, not necessarily adding nursing home wings, came to something like $7,000 or $8,000, but I'm going back 2.5 years. And what kind of study? Will you continue to use Perkins Eastman and they'll hire an engineering firm and they'll hire a cost estimator? I mean, can you give some kind of
We're going to
feel?
continue with Perkins Eastman because they've done the initial study. They're basically right now going to do a code review and a space review of the bill, space study. That could move into a structural study just to determine what we could do, how we could flex the space within the building, and that's where it'll stop.
Okay, so code and space initially. Thank you.
Mr. Mason.
How long? What's the time frame on doing this work?
We're ready to pull the trigger once you give me the money.
No.
30 to 45 days.
30 to 45 days.
Because it's important we give the performing arts some kind of an answer of what we're going to do with the building.
The Board of Ed has to come back.
Yeah, and then we have the Board of Ed to, deal with too.
They have to make their determination as well.
I'm sorry, Mr. Simon and then Mr. Finger.
So, from my point of view, this study is not ready to go yet because we need to know what the Board of Ed wants to do first, and we have a fixed amount of money. We have a fixed amount of money in our budget, maybe $10 million between fixing up the Board of Ed headquarters and fixing up the senior center. And we need to find a solution that is fiscally within those limits and also depends what the Board of Ed wants to do. So if the Board of Ed wants to move into the old town hall, your study of the Havemeyer building will have a different scope to it. If they decide they don't want to be in the old town hall and they want to go somewhere else that costs a certain amount of money, now you're down to figuring out what it costs to build them and what it costs to fix up the old senior center, and therefore how much money you may or may not have to be in the Havemeyer building. And so unless you can solve all of these problems, and I think of these as sequential problems, and I don't think of this as being the first of the 3 problems to solve.
Well, if we don't move to determine whether the Havemeyer building's in excess, we will lose the Performing Arts Center. And the Performing Arts Center is off, for a lease. In exchange for a lease, they'll fix the building and bring it up to code, like similar to what we did at the Western Greenwich Civic Center. So then the town wouldn't have to invest any money in it. So I think we owe them an answer for that. And if we keep stringing them along, they're going to just pull out.
Well, but I don't think we're stringing anybody along, but what can you conclude from this study without knowing what the Board of Ed wants to do?
We have to assume the Board of Ed is going to leave the building.
But how do you know they're not going to go to the old town hall?
That's fine. There's $78,000 in one of my accounts for them to do that study.
So then if they go to the old town hall, your analysis of the Havemeyer building would be different than if they didn't go to the old town hall and you were using the town hall and part of the Havemeyer building.
For
the seniors.
Seniors would fit into the Havemeyer building and the Board of Ed would move into the old town hall.
And then you're back to what can you do for $10 million? And you can't renovate, in my mind, you couldn't renovate the old town hall and the Havemeyer building for $10 million.
Well, don't remember, the old town hall's the exterior's already been completed, so it's just an interior renovation.
Right.
You have to do something with if the Board of Education's not staying in the Havemeyer building and they're going to go someplace, you have to do something anyways. And if you're going to do something for the seniors and it's not in the Havemeyer building, and if it's not in the old town hall, where's it going to be?
Well, that's another question to ask.
That's another whole question to ask. And before we lease something to somebody else, we determine whether we could use the building.
Mr. Finger?
I agree with Mr. Simon in terms of the timing. I think it's important that the Board of Ed do their study and analysis before we go and spend another $30,000. And I'm not sure, even if we spend the $30,000, that we accomplish what you seem to want to accomplish, which is, among the things you want to accomplish, which is being able to let the Greenwich, the Center for the Arts know whether they're going to have the building or not. Because $30,000 is a program analysis, space analysis. I don't think there's any way that for $30,000 we're going to be able to do a cost analysis as to what it will cost to do all the things to bring the building up to code, to accomplish the, to provide the space that that either the Arts Council, the Senior Center, or the Board of Ed would need for that building. So I just, I think we need to have the Board of Education do their study first, and quite frankly, if we're doing this to try to dot the i's, cross the t's, that's fine, but at the end of the day, again, I agree with Mr. Simon, it's hard to imagine that we're going to do any kind of renovation for the Havemeyer building and stay within the $10 million number. I just don't see it. So to spend another $30,000 to get where, I just have a problem with that.
One of the things that we've done, or the assumption that we made, is that I've heard the BET say on several occasions that the Board of Education has to move off of Greenwich Avenue. We've talked about this in the budget meetings this past year, and it was discussed last fall, because the Board of Education has used funds, they have been appropriated funds to find other locations before this. So our analysis has always been for the Board of Education, or the assumption that the Board of Education would move out of the Havemeyer building. If that's the wrong assumption, then I can see your point in delaying this. But if the assumption is correct, then we should move along here, because we're going to have to determine if this is even a viable project for the seniors. And will we stay in the $10 million? We did an estimate based on what we actually spent at the Western Greenwich Civic Center, which would be a similar project for the Havemeyer building, based on square footage, and we took it out 5 years using 3% inflation, and we're about $13 million. So whether you keep the building for the Board of Education or you keep it for the town, the way the building exists right now is going to be in the vicinity of $13 million.
Mr. Stone?
A question and then maybe just a statement based on the response. Mr. Minnelli, will you be getting from Perkins Eastman, besides a study of the configuration and pairing that with the future needs of the senior center, will you be getting a reasonable cost estimate as to development up to code?
No, we're not asking for that at this time.
So nothing to validate or increase the amount that...
Because a lot is going to depend on how the seniors proceed. I mean, Mr. Walco just said that, he was just citing some square footage numbers of what the senior center is now, what the study said, and Sam just said that they were looking for something less. A business plan would have to be constructed because they're going to have to obviously expand their program. I don't know if you guys are going to accept that or not.
I'm not focusing on the seniors.
But I have to understand how we're
seniors'
developing
needs
the
per se. I'm
space.
focusing rather on the building itself and the requirements to bring it up to code. Because we've heard and you've seen, I believe, the results of the study that was done by a potential tenant in that building, that the cost to bring it up to code would be close to, if not in excess, possibly of $20 million.
Yeah, what they were doing was they had some special requirements for what they were going to use the building for, and they were including some additions that they were going to construct.
No, this $20 million did not include the upgrades for the theater, et cetera. If you don't have the
I'm not
comment
in
on
agreement with that
Okay.
number. I'm using a real number the town used. If you look at the Western Greenwich Civic Center, we gutted that building down to the masonry walls and rebuilt the place. I'm sure you've all seen what it came out to be, and that was $218 a square foot 2 years ago.
Okay.
And I've just projected it out at 6% for 5 years in the future, and I'm applying the square footage numbers, and I'm getting
Okay.
13 million.
So what we'd be getting from this particular study is essentially a response as to whether the seniors' requirements, configuration-wise, would fit within the Havemeyer building?
Yes.
Okay. Based on that, I have felt all along, and I feel it even more at this point in time, that this money is particularly earmarked to study the building more than just the seniors' possible use of the building. But the seniors' possible use of the building, if I'm not mistaken, is particularly driven by a room, let's call it a facility, that Perkins Eastman has developed, which I'll call, for lack of a better term, the great room, for which there's clearly no room, no way of fitting it in to the existing senior center. And we've heard from an interested party, again, and one that we obviously can't take their word as being the driver on this, but the Center for the Arts has had its own engineer look at the design of this great room and determined that they don't believe that the great room could fit within the Havemeyer building without the expenditure of an enormous amount of money because of lack of other types of structural columns, et cetera.
Well, that's true, and there's the auditorium space in the Havemeyer building that we need to have measured and look at to see if that great room requirement can be accommodated by that room. But the other two is that the Commission on Aging and myself have met with their requirements of the Perkins Eastman study, and we've been paring that needs list down. And their central requirement is that they stay in central Greenwich. And if they don't stay in central Greenwich, that's essential. That's really your whole program, is to stay downtown. One of the issues. One of the issues. And they're going to have to make some accommodations to stay downtown.
Well, Mr. Chairman, just one other comment, and that is I'm not disagreeing with the need eventually, and hopefully in the short term rather than the medium, and definitely not the long term, to know what the Board of Ed intends to do. As this board knows, another colleague, Nancy Barton, and I have been delegated to study the needs, basically, or the let's call it the possible applicability of two buildings in the downtown area, the Havemeyer Building and the Senior Center. And in that connection, we're meeting tomorrow with the chairman and the vice chair of the Board of Ed to further discussions we've already had on a preliminary basis concerning their own requirements. They are in the process, I believe, of scheduling shortly after we meet, scheduling an agenda item for discussion at their board to move this particular question along. But even should they decide to try to stay in Midtown or move to another location, we as a board are going to have an idea, or the town will have to have a good idea as to what the possible applicability of the Havemeyer Building is for the senior center. So I think it would be money well spent, and I intend to support it.
Ms. Barton first, and then Mr. Kremick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My concern about spending the money now is that nobody has as yet vetted the senior center plan in terms of cost and scope going forward. So we'll be comparing a plan that has been designed by some consultants, that the Commission on Aging approves, that Mr. Deibler supports, but that has not received a thorough study outside of that group to determine if the town is prepared to go forward on that scale. It would more than triple the current program. And I would really rather see us study that plan and figure out what is realistic to go forward, and then figure out where to put it, than to look at a building that we happen to maybe own if the Board of Ed decides to leave it, and then figure out how to shoehorn a program that we haven't vetted into that space. I just think we're going about this in the wrong order.
Mr. Kremick.
The timing is unfortunate, but I will remind this board that we are in part responsible for that. If you remember, when we were voting on whether to approve this funding, a majority of this board decided that the studies would be sequential, that the seniors would do their study first and then the Board of Education would do their study. Some of us said that it should be concurrent because we could foresee that there'd be a timing issue. Right now, I submit to this board that there is a window of opportunity. There's a window of opportunity to save and renovate for public use 2 landmark buildings. And that what we should be looking at is space utilization and the best way to use that landmark space for the benefit of our town. And that requires 1, imagination, 2, flexibility, 3, seizing the moment when the moment is here, and the moment is here now. And I hear, and I know Sam and the Commission on Aging have the best interest of the seniors at heart, and they want a place where the seniors can gather. Well, guess what? The Commission on the Center for Arts wants to build 2 theaters where seniors can gather. They want a great room so that there is social opportunities for seniors. Well, there doesn't have to be a great room for social opportunities. I mean, you look at the way the Bruce Museum is used now. There are social functions there all the time. And this Havemeyer building could be renovated for those purposes. So I would urge folks, 1, to approve this because I think that they can use professional help in determining space utilization, but really this is the time to do it, and we should not hold them back. And for all those reasons, not the least of which is, looking forward, we're not going to knock down these 2 buildings. They're both landmark buildings. As a practical matter, we'll know what the Board of Education is going to want to do fairly soon once they start their study, which I assume they're ready to start. They certainly have the funding. All this has to be going on concurrently if we want to take advantage of the possible use of the Havemeyer for the Center for the Arts. If we're not interested in that and we're just going to go ahead and use them as municipal buildings, well, then we have to start planning for quite expensive renovations.
Mr. Mason and then Mr. Stone.
I was the negative vote in the Budget Committee on this, and although I have my reservations, I want to bring out, we're talking about planning, and the one reason I vote against it, and it's hard when Mr. Manelli gets up here, he's a pretty good sales guy. I hope he doesn't show up at my house with a vacuum cleaner. But one of the things that I'm seeing is in the CIP, in the capital model that we have moving forward, and we have the Board of Ed relocation for headquarters, X amount of $1 million. We've moved it out once or twice. Their priorities have changed, different things. We don't have, and certainly we know that the next 4, not counting the one we just approved, but certainly we'll call it a 4 or 5 year period, we're not going to have the room, according to the current BET's guidelines on funding of capital projects, the ability to do these 2 projects. If the Board of Ed's needs assessment was done, this would be the next logical step. There'd be no doubt. This would be definitely the next logical step. And the code review and some other things I think are important. The problem I'm having is that we're working towards a project when we don't have the Board of Ed even out of the building, and the funding model isn't there. So are we starting down the road for something that we don't want? Take every other criticism that we've had about our capital financing plan, yet it passes the RTM overwhelmingly because everything starts with a plan, with a placeholder, needs assessment, architectural engineering, land use approvals, and then funding. This project should follow this, and I am torn on this one, and I think that if the Board of Ed, if we had a time frame, and I think you may have that from Nancy and Bob after their committee meeting, if we had a timeline when the Board of Ed's needs assessment might be conclusive, I think this might not even be an issue. It's not the dollars, it's just we're looking at trying to stick with a plan we've set up in the financing of it, and that's the challenge I see.
Mr. Stone, I'll get to you in a second. Any other comments on this? All right, Mr. Stone.
I just want to emphasize the aspect of the money possibly clearing the decks, and I think that's something we can't lose sight of. Clearing the decks for use of the Havemeyer building by a tenant, obviously other than the Board of Ed, which is, we know is a process that is beginning and has to be completed before we can take the next formal step. But at this stage, there is a potential user, one of undoubtedly others, in the form of the Greenwich Center for the Arts. It's unrealistic for us to believe that group will continue to hold together for an undetermined period of time. It's already been the better part of 3 years. While these other studies and determinations take place, I believe at this stage of the game we could spend the amount of money in question to at least satisfy ourselves as to whether these seniors could possibly use the Havemeyer building itself. If not, we know the decks would be cleared for use either by the Board of Ed, which is about ready to make a determination on its own, or another tenant. And that would be a significant byproduct of this particular study. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Tessie?
Just want to say two things. One, I can appreciate the amount of consideration you're giving to this, and I fully understand some members' concerns about the future implications the results of some of these assessments may have. But the simple fact, I think, is Mr. Crumick put it best in terms of, the timing is critical. We're at a point in time where we have an opportunity. We do have the ability to potentially harness the public-private partnership should the decision be made or the information come back that this building is not feasible for the seniors, or in part it could be used in tandem with the outside group. But also I want to assure you that one of the most important things that we are doing is working collaboratively. And on May 9th, I did convene a meeting in my office of all of the pertinent parties. I think just about everyone was represented. And I think we do have a dialogue going. And clearly, as you have 12 different perspectives on this, some closer to each other than others, the same held true for the governing bodies. But I think the consensus that day was that we need to move forward, that to do nothing was just to lose opportunity and to really consume time, which I think most people feel would be better spent on other initiatives. So I am cognizant of the fiscal realities. I am cognizant that we only have finite resources, and certainly take that into consideration as we move forward, working with Sam and Alan and all the other parties here. But I thank you for your time tonight in discussing it, and look forward to your vote on it.
Simon, and then we'll move on.
So, out of this study, you're not using any fiscal constraint as to what it would take to make the Havemeyer building meet the senior programming needs? And are you going to come up with two alternatives if the seniors remain in the old town hall and use this as a supplemental space or an overflow space, or if they're out of the old town hall and use this as a primary space? Now, one would assume for enough money, you could make the Havemeyer building into a perfect senior center. But that doesn't really meet the needs of the town. And so I want to make sure that if we're going to vote the money for the study, that there are at least reasonable constraints on what you're going to produce, and that you're going to produce for us the two options, which are primary space and supplemental space. Being that primary being we don't use the old town hall, supplemental being we spend X millions of dollars to fix up the old town hall, and this is what they would need for overflow or extra space.
I think we're certainly willing to take that into consideration. I mean, to be candid with you, the Center for the Arts has looked at an option that keeps the seniors in the Old Town Hall and adapts their program to give accessibility to seniors. That may not be the best arrangement for the seniors, but that's certainly out there as an option in discussion. So, you know, I think the one point that Alan made is that we want to look at this building to see how it would accommodate the senior program, what the potential cost is, yes, that's the entire senior program, recognizing there may be additional space, and other people have talked about, you know, using it to accommodate offices that are currently here at the town hall. I, for one, would certainly not ignore that. I think we can answer that question potentially too, because undoubtedly if you don't have it, someone else has. The RTM folks who participated raised that as a question. I mean, we're just trying to provide answers to the various questions, and then again run a parallel process where the Board of Ed looks at their future needs and the seniors look at theirs, and we get greater clarity.
Mr. Simon.
So we listed this as a B fund, but then the B fund is items for which we've bonded. And we never listed this as our original bonding items. So how do we add this to the same project code? We can do that
We should put it in the Z fund.
with a different project code?
This one.
The same project code. And does that mean that we take something out of the B fund? The reason I asked that question, we authorized bonding for a certain amount of money. We listed projects that added up to a certain amount of money. This would then exceed that certain amount of money?
We wouldn't borrow if this is coming from balance.
Say that?
This is coming from fund balance.
This is going to come from fund balance? You don't think it should be an A fund, a Z fund item?
It should be a Z fund. The B fund is just our internal mechanism for identifying capital projects that are being bonded versus those that aren't.
And so which one is this?
Z.
Z. So we should change the code on the agenda and the item? Okay, that would make.
Just one question.
Why not?
It was in response to Larry's point. Gentlemen, are you going to look into the utilization of this space supplemental to the senior center or not? I thought it was a little unclear.
To the senior center where it is now, Ed?
Yes, in other words, a future where we've got a renovated senior center, but they have supplemental needs for space that could be met in a Havemeyer building. Is that going to be a part of the subject of the study?
It would tell us, but we were going to do, Larry, what was the term you used, primary? We're going to treat it as a primary. But Havemeyer is the primary senior center location.
Can you look at both? Can you look at supplemental as well as primary? I mean, if you're going to look at a realistic possibility, and if the money's going to be spent for useful purposes, I think you're going to have to look at supplemental in addition to primary.
Any other questions? Primarily questions. Okay. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
If you could raise your hand, just so I can keep track. Mr. Norton, Mr. Simon, Mr. Stone, Ms. Tarkington, Mr. Krummick, I'm sorry, Mr. Mason, Mr. Campbell. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Bipartisan coalition.
Well, when you get to the next
Election
vote,
year.
Those against? Mr. Raymer, Mr. Finger, Ms. Barton, Mr. Walco. 7-4-0. Did I get that right?
Yep.
Good.
The item passes.
Mr. Chairman, may I just take 1 minute?
Sure.
I failed to do so at the beginning of the meeting. I wanted to take an opportunity to introduce the intern this year to the Office of the First Selectman. Some of you may have thought this is Mr. Crary's replacement, but Mr. Crary, Mr. Crary is attending his son's graduation this weekend. But this is Redmond Shareski. He is from Greenwich High School, and he will be with us for the next June 14th. So it's a pleasure to have him in the office and welcome him here.
Where were we?
Yes, I don't know. The assessor's report. Mr. Gortney? I see we're losing the Greenwich time. I guess we scared him away with that vote.
Let's do our real business now.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. In my report, I'm telling you that we are preparing the files to be turned over to the tax collector, and that there will be 66,000 consolidated tax bills issued. We're also now completing the work on the elderly tax credit programs. I'll be glad to answer any other questions that you may have.
Questions for the assessor? Mr. Simon?
Can you give us any updated statistics on the elderly tax?
There's about 300 applicants that have come in this year, several new ones, and there are about 300 that are carryovers from the biannual cycle. And we'll have probably some report in the next month meeting.
All right, thank you.
Other questions for the assessor? Just so everybody knows, the assessor will be here we will be going to executive session later on in the evening, or it's anticipated that we'll be going into executive session, I guess I should say, and the assessor is going to be here for that discussion. So any questions relating to that issue should be addressed at that time to the assessor. Ms. Tarkington?
Should I move we approve the assessor's report?
Sure, hold on, I just want to make sure. Other questions for the assessor? Okay.
I move we approve the assessor's report.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington.
Second.
Second by Mr. Finger. All those in favor?
Aye.
11-0-0. Mr. Shipman, thank you. The next are the BET committee and liaison reports. You should have all received in your packet all of the reports. Once again, I thank you for those. Of particular note, we're trying to get these special project teams off and running. Some are more advanced than others. I've asked Mr. Stone if you could say a few words, and then I'll obviously also open it up to Ms. Barton, as there are no real chairmen. But I know your committee, as we've just discussed, has moved along quite rapidly based on other moving parts. And maybe if you could just give us a little bit of flavor as to what you're doing, where you're headed, and we can at least sort of start to talk about what at least your special project team is doing and then move on from there.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is going to be somewhat shortened because of the conversations that we've just concluded concerning this other budget item. Obviously, we're dealing with a complex subject. We've got two buildings. We've got a variety, more than two potential users, a variety of unknowns out there. But let me back up, and that is that this team, Nancy Barton and myself, I've been charged with studying from a variety of standpoints future use of the Havemeyer Building and the Old Town Hall, which is currently the Senior Center. And within that context, we've met with Mr. Deibler a number of times. We met with Mr. Tessie, First Selectman. We've met with representatives of the board of the Granite Center for the Arts within the context of a committee that the First Selectman has just put together. We've met and had some useful discussions with the board chair of the Board of Ed. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we'll be meeting tomorrow with the board chair and the vice chair to further discussions concerning their own criteria for site location and space requirements, which were set a number of years ago, and frankly, a number of them, I believe, are in need of being revisited, and they're willing to revisit that, and we're having the discussions pursuant to that tomorrow, and then I believe they are already planning to formally schedule a discussion of this nature at a board of education meeting. In short, we're trying to deal with several moving targets here, and I believe, even though we had a split vote tonight, that we moved nicely in the direction of at least potentially clearing the decks for use of one of the buildings. And that's not it won't be a small accomplishment, because if the numbers that we've seen from various interested parties, and for that reason we can't accept them at face value, but if those numbers are to be believed, I think we're going to conclude that use by the town of the Havemeyer building, total use at least by the town, with all due respects to Mr. Krummick, by the town might turn out to be a highly expensive proposition. And what we might have with the Granite Center for the Arts, and I say might because we're a long way from having concluded that they are a preferred potential tenant, but it is a group that has been serious and has put together a number of donors, certainly potential donors, who are at this stage interested in basically funding renovation of that building, which is a big ticket item. Even if you applied a haircut to the numbers that the Center for the Arts have mentioned to us, it comfortably exceeds the amount that we've allocated for use of a future home for the Board of Ed. So we've got a number of meetings that we've already concluded. We've got, at the very least, several more ahead in the near term, and we look forward to input from all of you as well as people out in the public. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Parton?
I agree with most of what Mr. Stone said, except that I think, at least I, and I'm sure he as well, would be open to hearing, and we've met with Al Manelli in a handful of contexts, but would be interested in knowing more about the costs inherent in repairing both of these buildings. They are both magnificent landmark buildings in our downtown area that can and should be put to some public use, in my view. And they clearly both need a great deal of interior work. We don't have good price tags. I heard Al say in our presentation just now that he thinks the town could renovate the Havemeyer building for something in the neighborhood of $13 million. I've heard numbers in the $5 to $10 million range for the old town hall. It is entirely conceivable that the town might undertake to rehab both of those buildings itself without necessarily building a magnificent new stage and auditorium and so forth. But I think it's important for all of us to keep an open mind about what the potential uses of these buildings are, because there they are, we own them, and they're beautiful, at least on the outside. They could use some work on the inside, as everybody knows who's ever been in one of them. But that's the direction that we're coming from, is to flesh out the town's alternatives and the financial consequences of those alternatives so that we can be in a position to make intelligent decisions, I hope sooner rather than later.
Questions, thank you, both of you. Questions relative to the reports? Mr. Norton?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to repeat an invitation I extended at our last BET meeting involving the Audit Committee. According to GASB rules, we have to meet now with the outside auditor prior to the beginning of the annual audit in executive session, and I want to extend an invitation to all members of the BET to join us at our June 12th meeting, which will be at 8 a.m. in the Gisborne room.
Thank you. Mr. Finger?
Mr. Chairman, with regard to the audit report from the Audit Committee, there are 2 paragraphs in the report that reference the Board of Education. And I think it's quite possible that somebody who does not attend the Audit Committee meetings might infer from the 2 references in those references in those 2 paragraphs that the Board of Education has not been fully cooperative with the Audit Committee. And I, for one, would like to dispel any notions that people may have that they have not been cooperative. I found the Board of Ed to be very willing to cooperate with our requests, with the direction that we have indicated we'd like to see them go, and in fact, I believe they have been very cooperative. So I just want to make sure that that goes on the record.
Thank you, Mr. Finger. Other questions or comments relative to the committee reports? The Comptroller's report, Mr. Mynarski, our Comptroller.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, BET members. You all have a copy of the Comptroller's report, and I'll answer any questions at this time.
Question with respect to the parking fund FOI request. Has now that the budget has passed again on this issue, has that issue been resolved? Do we know?
We don't know.
Okay.
It's come up 3 years in a row. Mr. Walker, Mr. Mason, and I attended a public hearing at the Transportation, I believe it's Transportation Committee, and it resurfaced there, and we've been in contact with Wayne. As it stands, the Law Department was going to schedule a meeting between Roland, myself, the Law Committee, and the Law Department, and Mr. Small.
Okay. Other questions for the Comptroller?
Just a quick comment.
Mr. Mason?
Just a quick comment under annual budget process. That certainly does not represent the work that you and the Finance Department and Roland did. Thank you. That just is not a representation of how much work that you did, especially the last 2 weeks when it was at the committee and district level and moving up to it, the main RTM meeting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a motion to accept the Comptroller's report. Motion by Ms. Tarkington, second by Mr. Norton. All those in favor?
Aye.
11-0-0. Acceptance of treasurer's reports. Is there a question? Discussion? Can you get the numbers up?
Interest income?
I'm just joking, yeah.
You know, actually, if you do look at the OPEB section, OPEB had a very good month in the equity section. And if you go to page 2, you can see that they've actually, they've made over $500,000 year to date, even with some very, very negative returns in the last few months. So there is a positive to this report.
Other questions for the Comptroller? Can I have a motion to accept the treasurer's report?
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington, second by Mr. Norton. All those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions, 11-0-0. Approval of, this should read, instead of Budget Committee, it should be BET regular meeting of April 21st. There were changes. Did we get those?
Yeah, there were minor changes. They were circulated,
Right, I
just
got-
the
okay, yep.
changes. And then clean copies are at your desk tonight.
Great. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0.
Did we say who moved and seconded?
Moved by Mr. Mason,
Seconded by?
second by Mr. Norton. Thank you. A motion to accept the May 5th special meeting, moved by Mr. Simon, second by Mr. Finger. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0. Officers' report. Mr. Stone?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Mrs. Tarkington?
The report.
In the officer report, I will echo the sentiments of Mr. Mason to thank the Finance Committee or the Finance Department for all of the work that they did with all of the committees, and also to thank all the BET members for all of their work in going to the meetings. As was previously discussed, it's important that we attend the RTM district and committee meetings. I think a lot of the questions were answered at that time, and we should be proud of the fact that the budget passed with simply the removal of the lights and a reduction by the Condemnation Commission. And I think that's a testament to not only what we did during the budget process, but how we handled ourselves during the budget process with the RTM. I also believe that half of what we do is educating the RTM to ensure that it gets approved. In fact, we did that again this year, and for that we should be thankful and appreciative of each other's work. Jokingly, I had a conversation with the first selectman that I don't think I've had as much conversation about any item more than this $30,000 PW10. Although he's not here, I would applaud the first selectman in bringing that forward. Clearly, he has a vision. Clearly, he is trying to get all of the stakeholders in the same room, and clearly, he wants to try to resolve this. I don't think that our vote tonight is necessarily indicative of supporting him in that effort. And I think work needs to be done. We have a special project team in that area who have been invited to attend all of these meetings, and we look forward to seeing where that heads in the future. There are obviously fiscal constraints involved. That is all that I have for this month. Obviously, a lot of time was spent relative to the budget process, and we will be looking toward the summer months to sort of tie up loose ends before we again start with next year's budget guidelines and getting full swing into that process. I would ask that you start thinking about August. Ask also Finance Department to start thinking about whether or not we're going to need an August meeting so that people can plan accordingly. Obviously, we schedule one every year, but at least for the past, I think it's been about 4 years, we have not had an August meeting, maybe even longer than that. So if Finance can start looking at that, and we'll take a run at it maybe next month to see where we are so people can start planning accordingly. Okay. Old business, new business, resolution concerning cash management. I guess this goes to the BET Investment Advisory Committee, whichever one of, Mr. Norton?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, as is indicated, the resolution was presented to us on April 29th, and we met and approved this 2-0.
And you so move now?
Yes.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Finger. Discussion. Just so I'm clear, because a couple of versions went out, I saw some email traffic on this. This is the one with the 3 pages?
Yes.
Questions, comments, discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0. Mr. Mynarska, are you presenting this next item? Norton Finger, sorry. take this first.
Okay.
Sir, if you're here for planning and zoning, they're upstairs, I think.
The actuary for the pension fund and for the other post-employment benefits fund is EFI, EdFriend Incorporated. And by charter, we're required to have a pension actuary report every year. And we've also had I guess the terminology is valuation of life and medical benefits for retired employees. I think we've had it for about 7 years now, and it runs concurrently with the pension actuary report. The and I'll refer to this as the OPEB valuation. This was the last couple of years have been very difficult, and I'd like to extend special thanks to Larry Simon on all the work he's done in this area. We've we've spoke over teleconferencing, Mr. Simon, myself, Roland Geiger, and Jim Lavin. It was a lengthy process, and hopefully we've gotten to the point where we can get this document out in a much more timely manner so that it gets to the BET with a budgetary number before the month of February. This is the product. We have it, an RFP going out this week. It was supposed to go out today, probably tomorrow, for both the pension actuary and the OPEB actuary report. And again, special thanks to Mr. Simon. We looked at the City of Stamford's actuary report. We're trying to get a document that's in a more readable, simpler format so that it's understandable more easily. But basically, that's this year's actuary report, and I bring it to you for acceptance this evening, to be filed with the town clerk, along with the pension actuary report, which was accepted a couple months ago. Any questions?
Motion, please.
I so move with the acceptance of the report for July 1st, 2007.
Moved by Mr. Simon. Second by Mr. Stone. Discussion.
Just accepting it, so.
So next year, when do we anticipate getting this report?
I believe we put December 1st as a requirement. I'm sorry?
Put December. I think it could be December 1st, sometime in December.
So we have the report in time for budget deliberations.
Prior to it, definitely for February.
And we've also simplified the report requirements without having to go through this percentage of payroll, implicit, explicit costs. We're going to make this process much simpler. I mean, what he produced is more than we need.
Questions, comments? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0. Thank you. We have two items. Before we get to two items, Mr. Mason brought to my attention that there were minor adjustments made, and I'll file this under old business, I guess. There were amendments made to the resolutions on the RTM floor. They were minor, but they were made. Do we then have to approve those?
It's on the agenda, right after the mill rates.
I think the answer is yes.
Oh, I see. You combined it that way.
You combined it,
Okay.
But,
Never mind.
Mr. Chairman, we would have to approve those resolutions because both bodies have to agree.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So, golf course assessment and appeals, my understanding is we need to go into an executive session for that. Before we do that, the only other item we will be taking up, or the other two items, would be the mill rate and the budget resolutions. But we'll be taking it in that order. So, for those in the audience, we'll have one item after our executive session, or what I anticipate to be the executive session, which would be the setting of the mill rate. I would estimate that our discussion pertaining to the golf course assessment settlement would be half an hour. Okay. Is there a motion to go into executive session?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Norton. All those in favor?
Aye.
11:00. It's to go. It's at 8:12, and it's to discuss the proposed golf course assessment settlement. Those the mill rate resolutions have been provided to us. Is that correct, Mr. Minarski? This 3-page. And to be clear, at least with respect to the general fund, a tax rate of 8.035 mils would be a 3.5% increase in the general fund mill rate. Turning the page, the sewer maintenance fund with a 0.338 mils would be an increase of
0.09.
0.9.
And turning the page to the sewer improvement fund, the mill rate of 0.065 mils. 20.37%. So taking the first page, the Town of Greenwich resolution for general fund tax on assessment list of October 1st, 2007 for fiscal year 2008, 2009. Can I have a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Ms. Tarkington. Discussion. Ms. Barton.
I would like to amend the resolution as proposed, to change the proposed tax rate from 8.035 to 8.065.
Moved by Ms. Barton, second by Mr. Raymer. I will say that I believe, and I'll look to Mr. Krummick on this as well, just based on his longevity here. I thought we sort of follow the RTM rule where we tend not to amend motions, but we tend to vote on items either up or down and then move on to the other application.
No, I actually think it's the other way around. I think we do amend motions. We vote on the amendment and then
take up the item.
And we take up the item as amended.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's the way we've always done it. Therefore,
So
it must be right.
Therefore, it must be right.
The amendment is to increase the mills from 8.035 to 8.065. All else would remain the same?
Yes.
And that motion was by Ms. Barton, second by Mr. Raymer. Discussion, Ms. Barton.
The reason for my request, or my motion to increase the mill rate to 0.65% is that we have a fairly significant set of tax appeals that we propose to settle that I think we need to cover in the tax rate going forward. We are drawing down this year quite rapidly the reserve funds that have been set up for both capital and operating expense, and I believe it is prudent to make provision in what promise to be difficult economic times to absorb a little bit more in the way of surprises in the next fiscal year than the tax rate that's recommended would do.
Discussion on the Barton-Raymer amendment to increase to 8.065. Mr. Krummick.
When we first adopted the budget, we assumed certain revenues would be coming into the town. Because of events that will happen, and we've learned about since we passed the budget, with respect to some tax appeals, we could and probably will stand to lose, I'll say, approximately $1 million. If we wanted to make that up, a lost revenue of $1 million to our the analysis given to us by the staff we would have to change the mill rate to 3.89%.
An increase of 3.89%.
An increase of, mill rate of 8.0650, but an increase of 3.89%, which, although I believe it's still within our guidelines, wouldn't meet the 3.5% that we had projected and we had represented to the RTM, would be the increase. I think I could, under many circumstances, support this increase as a fiscally prudent thing to do, and I certainly applaud the people who have moved it. I believe that on this circumstance, I will support the 3.5% for many reasons, one of which is we've already set that, we've represented that to the RTM. I believe we will have cash flow, certainly we'll have cash flow sufficient to meet our needs. I'm concerned that if we have a year like we had this year, or as we project next year, things will be tight. But I noticed when I looked at this impact that if we had a $4 million loss of revenue, we'd have to increase the mill rate another 5%. And it just so happens that that's the amount of the conveyance tax revenue that we project. $4 million. If we lose the conveyance tax, it blows a $4 million hole in our budget. And I understand that some of our state legislators are thinking about letting the conveyance tax sunset, and I think we should let them know what a $4 million hole in our budget would look like. We'd have to go up another 5% in the mill rate. So I think someone should tell them that. I think maybe I did.
Mr. Raymer.
It seems appropriate not to be making adjustments in contingencies that are reserved just for the purpose of maintaining an appearance of a mill rate target that we had hoped to keep. If you don't make an adjustment of the contingencies for that purpose and simply allow the mill rate to be adjusted to deal with the factual anticipations that we have, then it justifies the mill rate, the percentage increase that has been proposed in this motion. And I think it's a fair representation of what we're budgeting for to now budget for the slightly higher mill rate as a fair representation of exactly what we have on our plate before us.
Other discussion? All those in favor now, just so everyone's clear, of the amendment to increase the mill rate to 8.065. So it's the amendment that we're voting on. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Raymer, Finger, Barton. 3. Opposed? Abstentions? 3. Was it 8? 0? 380. That amendment failed. Discussion on the 8.035. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Abstentions? 10, 1, 0. Ms. Barton, you were the only one against, right? Did I get that correct? Thank you. We got the votes on that? For the sewer maintenance fund, as presented, 0.338 resolution for the sewer maintenance fund tax on the assessment list of October 1st, 2007 for fiscal year 2008-2009 as presented. Can I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Mason.
Second.
Second by Mr. Simon. Discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0. Resolution for the sewer improvement fund tax on assessment list of October 1st, 2007 for fiscal year 2008-2009, 0.065 mils. Can I have a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Mason. Second by Mr. Simon. Discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Moving to the resolutions. The first that comes before us is Resolution 3. The addition is in bold. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0. The second is Resolution 28. The deletions are stricken and the additions are in bold. These are the ones that were approved by the RTM last week. May I have a motion to accept?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion?
Question.
Question.
Who brought that change up?
Mary Ferry, she called someone.
That's the, okay. I wasn't sure. Thank you.
She called the state on this or something. She talked to somebody, she says. Okay. Any other, all those in favor?
Someone verified this exists, right?
Opposed?
It's been verified by the law department.
Abstentions? 11-0-0. Any other business? Motion to adjourn? Mr. Raymer, thank you.
And